It's actually live. Or waiting for Facebook to finish, get it going live. Yeah. Well, just started actually raining, which is good. And also, I don't want to be outside in that.
Ash-filled rain.
Okay. Facebook's complaining. Maybe Facebook doesn't want to publicize a conversation about AI.
It is somewhat disconcerting to use certain platforms to express deep concerns about those exact same platforms.
If it doesn't work, we can just post it later.
Yeah.
Should we just get going?
Yeah, just get going.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. As you, I'm sure, know, my name is Amita Kuttner and I'm running for leader of the Green Party of Canada. I am speaking with you all today from the unceded territory of the Siaman people, also known as Lasqueti Island, British Columbia. The format of these events are we're exploring certain ideas about policy and other topics today about artificial intelligence and automation with our special guest, Professor Anthony Aguirre, who I, of course, will let him introduce himself in a minute, but was my professor for my PhD in physics and got me into this in the first place. And by this, I mean politics and tech policy. So I'm excited to, share this conversation with everybody. The format of tonight is basically I will prompt questions and interview for about half our time for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have open floor for questions about whatever it is. I think I pretty much gave my own background in there, which is I have a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics, and I've done work on tech policy. I was critic for science and innovation for the Green Party for a couple of years. And during that time, brought forward pretty much Canada's first policy in anyone's platform around artificial intelligence and automation, and learned a lot about the policy process and the hiccups therein as well. But it's one of these topics that is actually incredibly important with larger technological issues at the moment that is often left out. And we desperately need policy and preparation and forethought. And we don't seem to see it almost anywhere. And I'm really happy because it fits in with the Green Party concept of being concerned about the future and actually being ready from a legislative point of view instead of just waiting for stuff to mess up and then cleaning up. So Anthony, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation to come on. As Amita said, I'm a professor of physics at University of California at Santa Cruz, and I had the privilege of being the faculty advisor for Amita during her PhD thesis on black holes and wormholes and other esoteric things. But we also had, as she said, lots of time to converse about all manner of things involving technology and the long-term future of technology and science. And this is something I've been getting much more interested in recent years. With a couple of other physicists and AI researchers, I co-founded the Future of Life Institute back in 2015. And that institute has been broadly concerned with transformative technologies, AI, biotech, potentially disastrous technologies like nuclear, and looking at what are the long-term implications of those, what are the threats, what are the possibilities, and how can we, try to proactively take action now, both on policy and other fronts, to kind of make those huge technological transitions happen as well as possible. So although my day job is as a theoretical physicist and cosmologist, like Amita, I've gotten this avid policy interest. And she claims that my complaining to her about concerns about AI and sort of the opportunities and how much needs to be done help nudge her into this political and policy-oriented place that she's gone. So, which has been very, very, very exciting to me. As you know, so few people in politics and in government who actually understand science and technology. We desperately, desperately need more. So I'm very enthused that she's taken up this race. So I'm happy to be here and chatting about AI and AI policy in the future, and yeah, ready to talk.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you say, I claim it. It's true for me, so I think I get to say it. So I think just to give some framing for the beginning of this conversation, we should talk a bit about what we mean when we say AI, because it's one of those words that shows up everywhere. And I mean, it's a very broad term in reality, but I think the kind of lack of definition and detail in public understanding and literacy about artificial intelligence as well as automation makes it so that we have a bunch of fears and a bunch of hopes, a bunch of expectations, which don't always match up with reality while other ones do. So if you give a short intro about what does it actually mean when somebody says artificial intelligence, and for this, I think, what areas are we going to be actually talking about policy about, and then what are things that we need to keep an eye on, but maybe we're not developing policy around it immediately.
Yeah, okay, so there are a few things to lay out, I would say. So from back when computers were essentially first invented back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, people have thought about, well, this is something that is thinking, it's a thinking machine, and started to think about the idea of what would it be like if machines could think the way that humans do, even though, even then they were sort of more like a calculator. They would do particular computations, but not think in the sort of flexible way that humans do about a variety of topics. So there got to be, the general notion of computer science, where you would write programs that would do a specific set of steps, and you would have to understand what the problem is, program the computer to solve that problem, and then the computer would present you with the solution. And this is how most software has worked through the history of computers up until fairly recent times. Most problems that you have a computer solve, you tell the computer how to solve the problem, the computer solves it. Now, the way I think about the way I think is useful to think about AI is that it's a set of techniques for computation in which you more tell the system what the problem you want solved is, and the system figures out how to solve it. You give it the goal, and that system works out how to satisfy that goal. So for example, you might have so you don't have to explicitly specify how to do it. You can have the system learn, and this is where the term machine learning comes from, how to do it. So for example, when you talk to Google or Alexa or something, this was a hard problem for a long time. How do we recognize human speech? And you could try to program step by step, okay, listen for this kind of thing, and that's going to sound like a D, and then look for an O, and so you could try to explicitly program all that. But that turned out not to work very well. What works, rather, is to have a huge set of data where you hear someone saying dog and have that associated with the word dog. And then you have a system that can absorb that data and learn from that data the association between those sounds and words. And so when you say the word dog to it, it recognizes it as the word dog. So nobody exactly told it how to do that. The system learned how to do it. And that's sort of the hallmark of machine learning. And machine learning is sort of a component of AI, as it's generally been construed as the sort of thinking, this is very rough, the sort of thinking that humans do. Again, where you don't have to explicitly tell someone how to think about something, they'll sort of figure it out. So there are a few different sort of divisions that artificial intelligence has been put into. Broadly speaking, you can think of it as two useful categories are narrow artificial intelligence and more general artificial intelligence. And the narrow is the sort that is sort of constructed to satisfy some particular task or need. So like a speech recognition system would be a narrow artificial intelligence, or something that recognizes faces would be narrow artificial intelligence. So these can do sort of one thing. Again, you don't have to tell them how to do it. They figure out how to do it by learning from a large set of data, but they just sort of do one thing or maybe a couple of things. Very different from a human, where if you take a capable human, you can give them all sorts of different tasks and say, okay, I want you to figure out this and this and this, and they'll figure out all those different things. Whereas an AI system, if it learns how to play Go really, really well, it can be fantastic. The best Go player in the world would have no idea how to recognize the word dog, even though another AI system can do really, really well at that and have no hope at playing Go. Any person can recognize dog and play Go at least a little bit, even if they're terrible at it like me. So those narrow AI systems are, for the most part, the sort of systems that we have now. Those have, in the last 5 or 10 years, become economically useful and important, and underlie a lot of the technology that you see, in the modern internet economy. Underlie search engines. Those are essentially machine learning AI systems. News feeds are AI driven. Most things that have some kind of matching algorithm or recognition capability in them have machine learning underlying them. So they're here in little bits and pieces in all these different systems that we use. And then every once in a while, more explicitly, where you feel like you're interacting with some human-like thing, like when you call a call answering system and there's a machine voice that answers you and pretends to understand what you're saying and you get really frustrated with it. That's a couple of narrow AI systems put together into something that sort of acts like it's a human. So that's worth laying out, that what we have now is mostly a large set of narrow AI systems for particular purposes, which are packaged together into products that, that feed the cycle of developing better systems like that. These are different from the sort of classic dream of AI, where you have a machine that thinks and sort of figures things out in a similar way to a human. Again, that has this general and flexible intelligence that you can give it a variety of different problems. It can solve all those different problems. That sort of AI is still a ways off. It's unclear exactly how long that is. It could be decades. Some people say centuries. Some people say years. We really, really don't know how far away that sort of broad, powerful, so-called general artificial intelligence is. But as we'll discuss a little bit more, even though could be rather far away, it has a lot of implications, and it may be worth thinking about those implications and what we might do to prepare for them now.
Great. Primer. Yes, I think for majority of this conversation, we'll be sticking to talking about narrow AI, because that's the type of stuff that we can really be getting ready for from a policy standpoint, but we can't ignore the possibility of general AI. So right along that, actually, let's talk a bit about both and the differences in terms of what are the positive outcomes? What are the negative outcomes? Or what are our fears and what are our hopes for this? Because I think that a lot of the time when we're talking about narrow AI too, people think about dangerous self-driving cars and less about, using AI systems for effective forestry management. And when you think about general AI, you're also then thinking about actual large networks of evil robots, and less about what the realities of development are. So I suppose, like, what are some prominent examples that show off the variety of what we talk about in terms of narrow AI, and then how is it going in terms of general AI?
Okay. So with narrow AI, I think we're now at a point, which is, and I should say the advances in AI have been happening very, very rapidly over the last 5, maybe 7 years. So there was kind of a shift around 2013, 14, 15, when it was discovered that a particular architecture of computational systems, so-called deep neural networks, combined with tons of data, and lots of computational power, which are also just becoming available, suddenly sort of started working. Like all these things that kind of worked a little bit before suddenly started becoming genuinely useful. Again, like speech recognition, automatic translation. You will have noticed that 5 years ago, automatically translating something with Google was kind of a joke. You'd get this ridiculous string of text out the other side. Made no sense almost. You could barely kind of make out what it was saying. Now, if you haven't tried it recently, try Google Translate. I translated just for a project of mine, I tried translating something between like 4 different languages and ending up back at English, and it actually was pretty good. It really carries the meaning. This has come a huge long way. I'm just emphasizing that this is shifting very, very quickly. What the different capabilities and even narrow AI are. And those are some examples of some of the things that we've now gotten kind of accustomed to, but were sort of would have been miraculous 10 or 15 years ago, just effortlessly translating text, recognizing speech, producing speech, recognizing images. You can now search for your son in your gigantic pile of 10,000 pictures that you have on your phone, and it will find them. Facial recognition, that's a nice one with positives, but we should talk about the negatives too. So there are all sorts of uses at some level, things that a person can be sort of very narrowly trained to do. Sort of any one particular thing that a person can do, like in a very repetitive way, we're now getting to the point where you can train a narrow AI system to do something similar. So in the same way that a person can recognize pictures of cats, you can train an AI to recognize pictures of cats. The same way a person can like edit grammar, a machine learning system can now edit grammar, like understand what grammatical suggestions there should be, and there is software to do this now. So all of these, so if you can think about it, and you could hire, a low-paid human worker to repetitively do it, you can probably train a machine learning system to do it now. And there's obviously a huge upside to this and a huge downside, because there are things that it wouldn't make sense to have a gigantic army of humans doing, but are worth doing. And now we can do those with machine learning. On the other hand, there are lots of things that we pay humans to do, and they need those things to make a living, that also we're now training machine learning systems to do instead of those people. So it's really a double-edged sword in that way in terms of sort of benefits and risks. So all of these economic products that really anything that we want to do that we want done cheaply and is a repetitive thing, translating text, like analyzing footage of things, analyzing imagery, aerial imagery, to look for interesting anomalies or something like that. All of these things that sort of were beyond reach because it would take just a gigantic number of people, those are now possible to do. So if you want something, I read a great project. You brought up something about forestry. Imagining a giant set of drones that were planting trees, where they would go out and look for, and this was using the machine learning, what is a good place to plant a tree, go and automatically plant the tree. And it could do this at a rate that was way, way faster than humans could do it, because they could fly and they could identify things and plant the trees. So a vast tree planting rate that would never happen if humans were doing it. So all of the things that we humans want to do and accomplish, machine learning can help. Right, in many, many, many of them. On the other hand, all of the things that we do that are not so great, it can also help with those. So in large part, it really is what we make it. So there's a side of machine learning and AI that is like any other technology and enabling, and so it enables us to do good things and enables us to do less good things. Then there are some issues about AI in particular that make it a little bit different from some other technologies. So that's how I would answer that generally, that there are sort of new powers that AI and machine learning are bringing that we have to watch out for. And then new, like qualitatively different aspects to it that are somewhat different than other technologies have had.
I think one of the things now about the expanded ability of AI and how kind of ubiquitous it almost is in a lot of the stuff that we use is the fact that we still have so many people saying we don't have AI, because they're talking about this dream of general AI and saying, well, my assistant is nothing, when it's actually advancing rapidly and changing and having huge capabilities, and if applied right can be an amazing thing. But like you said, it has to be applied right, and we have to address some of those issues. And I think somewhat because of that, there has been little warning of everything turning up so suddenly, and little preparation for the need for regulation and ethics and other things that are problematic when it comes to pretty much any technology, but especially the ones that are like this. And also the idea that we don't get ourselves out of our own minds of expecting anything to learn to think the way that we do. So we have a fundamental disconnect as humans with not knowing and not understanding how machine learning actually works, or what intelligence can mean constructed differently than our own. And so along this, I think there's been such great things, and I think we'll get a little later down to preparing for automation and the worries about work being displaced, because there's a lot of different thought on that. But in general, we've had some issues, and we will continue to have issues around bias and ethics and training data. And so you mentioned that we pass on some of our bad habits, but I think that that's both in unchecked usage, but it's also accidental.
Yeah, and you made a great point that people sort of keep denying that what we have is AI, and there's a joke in the AI community that as soon as AI can do it, it's called not AI anymore, right? AI is always the thing that machines can't do yet. But the things that they're doing now are things that certainly 10 or 15 years ago, people would have said, oh, so you've got AI. It can understand speech, it can talk to you, it can reason, it can win at Go, all these things that AIs are now doing. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the accidental risks. And one that you brought up is bias. And this is a really important one, because people have this idea that humans are biased and sort of machines or algorithms are objective and unbiased, and like you can trust them. And this is very, very complex, but it's certainly not like that, in the sense that the way these machine learning models work is there's a large set of data, there's this training data, and then there's a system that is trained essentially to, so if you imagine you have lots of sort of situations and results, and you give and the situations could be like a sound, and the result is the word dog. The situation could be a picture, and the result is the number 1, if you had a recognition system. So you match up in one form of machine learning, all these different pairs of kind of data and answer, and then train the system so that it then predicts, this is what the lingo that they use, predicts the answer given some new set of data that you present it with. Now, the result that you will get is very much, if your machine learning system is highly capable, very much in keeping with the data that you feed it. So if you feed large numbers of like correct data, it will give you, or of a particular type of data, it will train the system to do that. If you aren't careful, it will build in some errors in its inferences that no human would make. So there's a famous example that was kind of devastating for Google, that they had an image recognition system that was recognizing different people, but unfortunately they trained it primarily on Caucasian people and animals. So when African American people were fed into this system, it labeled them as gorillas because that was something that was human-like, but the color was much more like a gorilla than the rest of the humans in their sample. So this was like deeply hurtful, catastrophic for Google, embarrassing, and exemplified the fact that these systems really are dumb in the sense that that's not something any human would do, but it is something that can happen, the sort of thing that can happen when your data sample is sort of insufficient or malformed or badly labeled. So that's one example. In a less egregious, but probably very common case, any sort of biases that have been built into your data sample because of historical discrimination or inequity and so on, once they're in that data, they're also going to be in what the machine learning system does in response to that data. So if you, for example, have, segregated neighborhoods for historical, deeply unjust reasons, and train your AI systems on the sorts of people that should be offered mortgages in particular houses, you have to be very, very careful that the machine learning system doesn't say, oh, that kind of person doesn't look like the kind of people in that neighborhood. They're probably not such a great candidate for that mortgage. Right? So this is the kind of thing that can easily come into a machine learning system. Nobody programmed it to be racist. That was nobody's intention. And yet, if you're not careful, the racism that's built into the training data could be then built into the machine learning system that's based on it. So that kind of stuff is very, very difficult to manage and figure out how to deal with, because you have to figure out what is the right, here's the data. That data is building in a bunch of things that we don't really believe in necessarily. What do we then do with that? How do we change the data, or what do we do with that so that the actual values that we feel and believe in are reflected in the decisions that system makes, rather than the ones that are built in for historical reasons or whatever. That's a very difficult technical problem, but it's a problem that we're going to have to face all over the place as we roll out more and more machine learning systems that are making decisions or that are giving advice for us to make decisions on the basis of. This is another opportunity and threat in the sense that there are lots of these machine learning systems that give us recommendations. Anytime you go to Amazon or Netflix or something, that's recommending you movies or products, that's a machine learning system that's doing the recommending. You have to ask though, should I trust these recommendations? And there's a lot that goes into that question, depending on how that machine learning system was constructed, what its goals are, whose interest it has in mind. So this, for example, if you ask Alexa, I'd like to buy something, Alexa is not going to tell you something to buy that isn't on Amazon, right? That's not how it's going to work. Now, if you ask for a recommendation for something, that will come to you again according to some algorithm. But what exactly is baked into that algorithm? Is it really the very best thing for you? Is it the best thing for you that also paid some advertising money? Is it the best thing for you that they happen to have a whole bunch of extra ones in stock? So what exactly goes into that algorithm? And this is a pretty interesting difference from the way humans work, in that, if I were to say hire an assistant to help me, get my work done, I would know that that assistant was working for me with my interests primary. I would ask them to do something, and they would figure out, like, what is the thing that Anthony really wants? Let me get Anthony the thing that he wants. They would be working for me. When you have a personal assistant like Siri or Alexa, who exactly are they working for? They kind of feel like they're working for you, but it's pretty clear that they're not totally working for you, right? They're really working for Amazon or Apple at some level, or Google or whatever. And it's very hard to know what is baked into the recommendations or that they're giving, or the actions that they're taking, that is not necessarily your interest. So, I think all of these things we've been living with for a long time in our society. We're used to people trying to, like, steer us in various directions. If you go to the airport, if you fly into like Vancouver and you get a taxi, you get in the taxi takes you where you want to go, no problem. You get off the airplane in New Delhi and you get a little rickshaw outside of the airport. They're going to take you to their uncle, that wants to sell you something, and the rug person, like, you can go, depending on what sort of agent you're dealing with, they can either be governed by some fairly strict set of rules and just work in your interest and according to some very well-established contract, or they might generally take you off on some self-interested ride to whatever their interests are. So we're used to this, like, everybody's used to this in dealing with humans, but the difference is that now we're building these very large-scale software systems that hundreds of millions of people are using every day, and we don't really have any clear sense of where their loyalties lie, what is determining the sort of decisions that they make, what the ingredients of it are, and what the effects of those recommendations are going to be on a large scale. So that scaling up, the kind of massive duplication, where you're not dealing with one person, but you're dealing with effectively 100 million copies of that person that 100 million different people are dealing with, makes the scale totally different. Any sort of flaw in the system is going to be very, very magnified if you scale it up to 100 million people who are using that system, right? And that's something that's qualitatively different about machine learning and how it's impacting society, I think.
You made a really, really good point about that in there, about the assumptions that we make about machines being good or right or accurate. And in terms of AI systems, when you do have issues of bias, it's a really dangerous assumption to make. And so I've heard of other examples of, well, especially issues with race. And one of the funniest ones to me, because it's innocuous, is there were a series of paper towel dispensers that only reacted if you had light skin. And that's harmless. Well, it's not harmless. It's extremely irritating and shows that we have massive inequities and racism within the process of development of anything, but you're not actively harming people. Whereas you get that same problem with image recognition and light sensitivity when you're dealing with sensing pedestrians. Different problem, and like much bigger risk there than having things that are, giving you some paper. And also, as this is now being applied, we see, to predictive policing and justice systems, then you end up saying, okay, well, we're just going to be using these systems to perpetuate systemic inequality, systemic inequity, and a dangerously broken system. And we're not even aware, I think, a lot of the time, the depth to which our own systems are problematic. And the problem with passing this on to machines is people immediately say, oh, well, it has to be right. But it's no more knowledgeable than the data that it was trained on.
Did you hear I think it was a psychology study where they found that people were more likely to believe a robot even when they knew where the exit was. This was like a simulation where they had to find the exit. There was like a simulated fire. Then the exit signs, like people knew the way out. There was a clearly labeled exit sign, but the robot was telling them to go some other way, and they like followed the robot because it was a robot. Robots are smart, right? This is not true. Don't trust the robot, especially in the near future.
I didn't hear about that. That is terrifying.
So there's a, there are good reasons that there are a lot of wonderful technology systems, and for the most part, they operate pretty well, and we've gotten used to relying on them, and that's all well and good. But we do have to be aware of the complexity of what goes into building those systems. It's really genuinely tricky. Google takes you from point A to point B, and does it in a very efficient way. It looks at all the different possible routes. It now uses machine learning to estimate like how often these things will be clogged up so it can take you a good way and estimate how long it's going to take you. But there are design considerations go into them. So, you can imagine, suppose there were a 6-lane highway, and somewhere there was a little shortcut that could get you just a little faster than the 6-lane highway could. If Google were to redirect everybody onto that tiny little shortcut, it would be a catastrophe for that neighborhood, right? And a traffic jam. So that's a case, and this doesn't happen anymore with Google Maps because they've taken various steps to mitigate that. But they've been able to do that in part because there's rapid feedback, that they see that there are these traffic jams and they go, oh crap, we didn't really think about that. So we have to make sure that if there's a shortcut, it can actually like not go through a residential area if they're on a highway, blah, blah, blah. So set some extra rules. What's trickier is when you have a system deployed at large scale where there isn't that kind of obvious and quick feedback to the system or the engineers of the system to tell them that something's gone terribly wrong. It's taken a long time for lots of people to realize that recommendation engines and social media are causing huge chaos in our society by creating polarization. That was not obvious at the beginning. Most people think that that was not an intentional thing. That was an unintentional side effect. But it's taken a long time to recognize the problem, and it's still not clear that really anything is being done to substantially mitigate it. So those sorts of things, these are genuinely difficult problems. And if we don't have the right sort of, policies and governance and sort of incentives in place for the deployers of these large-scale machine learning systems to work really hard to do the right thing, there's going to be a lot of things that go awry. And when we're rolling out things again to hundreds of millions or billions of people, it doesn't take much going awry to cause a major problem.
I was just going to say, this is the perfect place to segue into talking about policy. And I think also in there, we should talk about ethics, because it's one of those things is, we can develop ethical technology, we can have ethical frameworks, but it's not so simple, because you have to answer the question, whose ethics and on what foundation they lie, and what are our shared interests or common goals. And even when it comes to stuff like bias, we have a lot of it ourselves as well. And so what we're saying is actually safe, even if to say something as simple as we want the common good is not obvious what that means or what something could be working for. And so you have to go through that process and then actually try to put it into some sort of algorithm, which is a mess. But we cannot go forward with any of this without having legitimate policy preparation and ethics frameworks. So let's now talk about what's kind of going on globally and what's going on in the US and Canada. What do we need or should we be looking at for ethics and oversight, and also how it relates to data privacy? And then I think for me, from a policy standpoint, other than getting ready to have a regulatory body, which I think could also give us economic strength by having trustable technology in general, we have to prepare for automation. What does that look like? What are the best things to do for that? And what does it mean when we really should be able to be having technology to advance the dream of reducing human labor so that we can have more enjoyment to our lives? Whereas right now, that's not particularly the trajectory that we're going to be on.
Yeah, so the policy question is a big and interesting one. I think and it's still very, very early days, I think, in AI policy. the idea of AI policy essentially didn't exist, more than 5 or so years ago, because again, most of these systems that are being rolled out are fairly new, and so there just wasn't anything to work with. And to the extent that there were things that were working, they were sort of like, they were just software. So there's no, there's no like word processor policy that the United States has. It's just a technology, and it's governed by lots of other policies and sort of frameworks that we have, and legal frameworks, but there's no word processor policy. But AI is now getting big enough and ubiquitous enough and important enough that people are actually thinking about that as a topic. A lot of what's happened so far, I would say, is for a few years between 2013 or 14 and maybe 2018 or 19, is the development of sort of principles upon which people think that policy should be based. So the Future of Life Institute, for example, spearheaded the creation of the so-called Asilomar principles on AI in 2017. You can look them up. They're thought-provoking, and this was an effort to just sort of see, can we find consensus on some of the things that AI should and shouldn't do. So for some of the principles are things like it should be, if you're making sort of judicial decisions, those decisions should always be like carefully explainable. If an AI system is making judicial decisions, it should be able to explain those systems and be audited by a human authority to make sure that it's actually making reasonable decisions, not just some black box that some company makes and sells to the state of California, just giving an example, in order to see how much they should be paroled and so on. So there's this principle creation phase. I think we're now sort of coming to the end of that, where countries are starting to genuinely think about laws and actual policies, but honestly, very little of that has happened so far. The European Union is currently undergoing a major policy effort, but no actual laws, have been passed. The U.S. still, I think, has not yet passed a law that has artificial intelligence in its title. Or actually, it might have passed something that created the National Security Commission on AI, of course, it being the US. National security comes first. But there are very few actual laws on the books that have to do with AI directly, but there are a lot of those things in development. So this is an important and actually exciting time if you're interested in policy and about thinking about how to shape the way that our societies deal with AI. This is the time to be thinking about it, because it's these formative, the policies that we set in place now are going to be very, very, going to have a very, very large impact on the way that machine learning systems and AI systems roll out into the world, because it's fairly early on. It's both early and it's late. Like there should have been policies in place years ago, but at the same time, it's just getting started, and these policies, AI is going to continue to be a larger and larger part of all of our lives, and so we're at the beginning of that whole transition. So yeah, I would say that there's a fair amount of activity. There's a lot of talking. There's a lot of meetings. There's a lot of policy research, or a fair amount of policy research. At the moment, not that many actual laws or formal policies being passed. On a state level, a few things have happened. A few things have happened on national levels, but I would say few, if any, countries actually have any sort of comprehensive policy on AI or machine learning that governs all these sorts of systems we've been talking about. So the time is very ripe for that.
Yeah, I think it's also, you mentioned facial recognition technology earlier, but I think that's a big one too, to just linking in data privacy and personal privacy, especially I think with I don't really know how to put it other than immediate existence of China as a surveillance state using such things, and that we need to be very much ready to make sure that doesn't happen. And it seems like one of those things when it comes to civil liberties that should be pretty urgent. And not having any regulations around it is dangerous. And I I think from my I attempt to be hopeful standpoint of things, wanting us to be able to use technology for positive reasons and having it improve our lives, I worry about the fact that when you have problematic systems and that's the first interaction that people have is unchecked, you then have a negative sentiment towards something overall. And then you somewhat miss your opportunity for something to be the best possible effect on society that it could be. And so that's kind of how I look at a lot of regulatory policy for Canada, as well as data privacy rights, and then in preparation for automation, because we don't want this specter to turn up, basically, that's going to overhaul our economy, which, well, it's going to happen for other reasons as well. But we need to be ready for it so that we can reap the benefits and not kind of just suffer for it. And so the big worry for me is that going along the trajectory we're currently on, you have large corporations saying, well, I'm still going to just try to get as much profit out of this, and I'm not going to have any problem laying people off. But they'll still try to hide behind the fact that they're not doing it for this reason, and it'll be about skyrocketing profits, and then people won't have work. And we need to kind of have this transition be equitable. And pushing back on it is not particularly going to work, but letting it just happen is definitely not a good idea either. So I feel like we need to find some middle ground where we're providing a basic income and career transition support, talking about also if we just want to maybe have everybody work less. And the feeling that I get, I guess, in my generation is a lot of us don't feel like the stuff that we do day to day has much meaning. And what we would actually be liking to do is stuff that we feel like is going to create progress in the world. And there's kind of, when people ask me if you're getting rid of work for people on such a large scale, maybe, what are people going to do? And I kind of just point outside and say, is this good? Are you happy with this? Because if you're not happy with this, then we got a lot of work to do. It's just figuring out how to make sure that people are actually doing that work and protecting them in the transition. And one of the most interesting things that I think I heard about the positive side of having good regulation, because you can also get pushback from industry and saying, well, we just want to be able to implement these with no checks. And I think one of the best arguments against that is that protection from the fear that people might have. And the power of good regulation and good ethics and good preparation is that you can have people be happy about the transition. It can end up better for everybody. And then you can also have economic strength. So going back to the thing about, say, facial recognition, there is a great need for trustable technology. And Canada right now is looking for economic avenues that will give us strength. And I think that focusing on technology that is actually ethical will give us a place in the world that no one else is really currently occupying, if we can get it together.
Yeah, I think this is a really crucial point, because there's a tendency, especially by industry groups, to set up this polarity between being sort of well regulated and privacy minded and so on, versus there being progress and products that work and so on. And this is these things are not at all in opposition. I think if you build the sort of regulations that or governance or what have you, such that people can trust the technologies that they're using, that's a win for the people, and it's a win for the companies that are building those things. So one very salient example that I think of is COVID-19 and contact tracing. So contact tracing, it would be really, really helpful, obviously, if there were a system that knew who had COVID-19 and who doesn't, and could, use that data to tell people who don't have it, that they're at higher risk, and to manage the whole thing. So it would be incredibly useful to have this sort of insight. And a main reason that that's not happening is that people don't want to share that sort of private data with some company or government because they don't trust them. And this points to a huge problem. If you can't, there are certain things, important things that we can't do because people don't have trust in the systems. And the only way that they're going to have those trusts is if that trust is deserved, because there are actual guarantees, both legally and in the software framework that's developed in response to those legal policies, that make those systems genuinely trustable. And right now we're sort of in the opposite side of things where, as I said earlier on, these machine learning systems work on large amounts of data. And where's that data coming from? It's being created by people, and it's being hoovered up by companies that are making machine learning systems. So the thing that Google and Facebook and all of these companies most want from you is large amounts of very detailed data about the things that you like and don't like and so on. And on one hand, they will say, well, we just want to know those things so that we can better serve you the things that you want, right? And that there's some truth to that. And in principle, that would be a great system. Something knows lots about me, like my wife knows me really well, so she can get me a really great birthday present because she knows me really well. I trust my wife to get me a birthday present. I don't have the same relationship with Google. We don't have quite the same relationship. So we don't have, there's a bit of a misalignment of interest where these companies essentially want to absorb huge amounts of data for their own purposes, rather than necessarily for the direct purpose of providing, a service to you in a way that respects the privacy and the ownership of that data that you're, supplying them. I think the whole thing is going to sort of just fall farther and farther into dysfunction until we work out the right way to safeguard the privacy and ownership of data in individual people who choose to share it for particular purposes with companies who then provide them a service, not this very weird system where companies are essentially hoovering up all of this data for their own purposes and using it to, yes, provide services, but also in various ways, manipulate and sell to and so on the people that are providing that, and don't even realize that they're doing it. And this has to happen, I think, at a policy level. It's, most companies are not going, whose many billions of dollars of year revenue is based on hoovering up this data and using it for advertising. They're not going to voluntarily give that up. And they're not going to voluntarily do something that curtails their ability to do that, even if it's in almost everybody's interest. So that sort of thing is going to have to come, I think, from outside and be a policy response.
I agree, and I think it's not a good time to have government be largely run by corporate interests in one way or another.
But maybe it's especially bad now.
But I think, and it's the importance of making the arguments of why, why leading on trustable technology is can actually be a big strength. Before we move on to question and answers, I just want to mention, I think one of the other important things, and, we kind of just went around talking about preparations for general AI because, well, I'm not sure how much you can really prepare for that, especially the timelines, but there is the issue of AI weapons.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a big one, and we haven't historically been very good at kind of agreeing to things internationally. And I think more than, I don't really want to say more than before we have to do this, but because with all the other ones, they're all also awful. And we really need to get it together and say, no, we need our nuclear weapons treaty ban. And we also are having the conversation about, space militarization, but
I would disagree a little with you in that we've actually done surprisingly well in the past with certain things. So nuclear, we kind of, whatever the consequences, we failed to curtail nuclear weapons development for many, many years. We have treaties now that non-proliferation and otherwise that help a little bit. But so that's, an existential threat to humanity that really has to be dealt with. It's a literally ticking time bomb. But if you think about chemical weapons or biological weapons or space weapons, those are places where humanity and sort of enlightened leadership got together and said, we actually don't want that. It's not so great if everybody can have a weapon of mass destruction that they make in their basement. That's not a good thing. So there was a convention against biological weapons, and the world has just been far better for it. You can imagine that if there had been an arms race in biological weapons for decades, an open arms race where just more and more weapons like the nuclear ones were developed biologically, the world would be a vastly more dangerous place. So we have done the right thing in the past. I think there's an opportunity to do it again with AI weapons. It's worth saying a little bit about what AI weapons, what that means. So when you say that phrase like lethal autonomous weapons is the phrase that often people use now, or AI weaponry, people sort of imagine like a robot soldier, carrying around a robot machine gun or something like that. And this is, possible, but probably the worst way to design an AI weapon. But what's more worrisome are things like swarms of small, robot or AI-driven aircraft, or large swarms of small drones or attack craft, autonomous planes, tanks, like little vehicles. And the important thing here is not so much that they're potentially, there isn't a human to be harmed, or that they're a little bit better as a fighter pilot or something. But what's really game-changing about this is that you can have the very large numbers of things that are happening automatically. So if you imagine, and this is something that the Future of Life Institute spent some time imagining, small drones, this size, that have facial recognition and can identify targets and fire, a charge to kill a person. That's a weapon that could, cost hundreds of dollars or less, and just pick out, people with particular characteristics. Maybe they're enemy soldiers, maybe there's some other characteristic, and kill them. And what's very different about this from a human army is that one person could send off 100,000 of these things, or 1 million of these things, whereas almost nobody has command over 100,000 or 1 million soldiers, right? So this really, in other words, AI weaponry has all kinds of implications, but one of them is that it really is a new weapon of mass destruction, like nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. It's a system where one person can effectively perpetrate violence on a huge number of people without a whole state apparatus behind them, without a whole command structure and so on behind them. And I think the unchecked development of these lethal autonomous weapons, an arms race in them and proliferation of them, is going to lead us potentially to a very, very dark place in a way that we haven't fortunately seen with biological weapons or chemical weapons. So that's something I think that requires urgent response. These sorts of weapons are being developed now. Now is the time before huge amounts of money are being made by arms manufacturers building them, before they're incorporated into large armies and become part of the sort of defense apparatus of major militaries. Now is the time to be thinking about, is this really what we want? To have these weapons that make kill decisions without a human like as part of the decision, where a machine decides to kill somebody. Is that what we want? And I think no. Most people think no, and yet it proceeds onward, and I think that's something that we have to do something about.
I get a lot of hope from the fact that we as a global community got together and said no to bioweapons and chemical weapons as well. And I'm still very cautiously optimistic that we'll manage to do the same thing with AI weapons. And I would encourage anybody to go learn about the campaigns to stop killer robots and other things that are happening, to see that we can get the world on board for it. Because I think much like this in the general conversation about AI, what happens is it is limited by people's imaginations. So the threats and the hopes kind of are all driven by where conversations have been. And therefore the risks about it are not clear, particularly in the same way. And the Future of Life Institute, I know, worked on a video that I can't watch that actually does show some possibilities of what AI weaponry could look like. So yeah, just general info on that. So that's kind of the end of the talking points that I'd gotten together. We have about half an hour to answer any questions, unless, Anthony, there's anything else you wanted to add in general before we move on.
No, yeah, I'm interested in what questions people have.
All right, sounds good. So usually for this portion, the other Anthony moderates. And if people have questions, we can do speaking order in the chat, and then we'll comments or whatever.
Yeah, so if people want to put a question in the chat or use the raise hand feature, Bob had to leave early, but he sent me a question, so we can get started with that one. Given that AI is starting to take some work tasks and will likely take on additional work tasks, should governments be taxing the output of AI systems? And if so, what do you see as a rational way for government to tax the output of an AI system?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's clearly, so the premise of the question is more and more jobs are going to get replaced by AI. More and more tasks certainly are going to get replaced, and probably more and more jobs are going to get replaced by AI systems. In the long run, that's probably, as Amita said earlier, going to be a really great thing. Like most jobs that people on Earth have are really unpleasant jobs, frankly. 100 years ago, that was true of physical labor. Most jobs were physical laboring jobs that a lot of us would not want to have. It's still true at some level with mental labor. A lot of jobs just suck. And not having to do them will be really great as long as we can still make a living doing something that we actually do enjoy, or make a living, based on some sort of universal basic income and have time and capability and freedom to do things that we do enjoy and feel are worthwhile. So I think there's huge opportunity there. The tricky part is that when we transitioned from manual labor to more mental labor, we were able to do that because there were lots of new jobs doing mental labor because machines couldn't do that. If you have machines that can do the physical labor and the mental labor, it's not clear how much left there is that humans are going to be able to do that the machines can't. There will be things, probably for a long time, but if those are a relatively small part of the economy, then we have to figure out, how we're going to support all of the people that want to do things that are worthwhile and interesting to them, but where they can't compete on a cost basis with a nearly free software system. So there are, I think, various ways that we could think about a system like that. So one possibility that was mentioned is taxation of various types. So they could just be taxation of very large companies, actually taxing them, which we don't tend to do very well in the US, probably a little bit better in Canada, but we can also think about more targeted sorts of taxes that are based upon how much work is automated by a given company. One of the things that I've gotten interested in are policy solutions where governments would purchase now shares in the companies that seem likely to create lots of automation in the future, and use those shares to establish sort of a sovereign wealth fund, as they do with oil resources, in oil-rich countries. So Norway and various oil-producing countries in the Middle East, and I think Alaska, have these large wealth funds that basically pay out based on this natural resource that is creating a large amount of wealth. So I think there's an interesting solution that I've been thinking a lot about of governments purchasing large amounts of shares in companies that are going to create lots of automation and presumably huge amounts of wealth in the future, and then using essentially the ownership share of those large companies to then repay out in some sort of universal basic income or the like. So it wouldn't quite be taxation, it would be a large wealth fund, but it would have a similar effect in that it would be redistributing the proceeds of those companies to the people. Now, it should be, to be clear, there's a perfectly valid basis for this in that the way that these machine learning systems are being created is using huge amounts of training and data that all we humans created for those systems. The intelligence of these systems is based on our intelligence. They're bootstrapping off of all of the work that humanity has done for thousands of years to build the understanding and knowledge and structures that it has. Those things, I think, belong to all of us. And if they get funneled into, an AI system that gets replicated 100 million times to replace 100 million workers, I think those 100 million workers ought to get something back for that. The question of how to do that in a way that is sort of economically workable and legally workable and keeps both power and income in the people rather than all concentrated in the corporations, I think is a difficult policy question that there are different solutions to.
And I think along those lines, with any sort of taxation scheme, if you do go down that road, making sure that it is well applied, so it's not, this horribly convoluted attempt at tracking down when anyone automates, but looking more to large increases in income and kind of like not just focusing on what the goal is here, which is making sure that you have tax income when you have less people working, and less so about the nitpickiness of figuring out who's automating. But I think that also connects to a couple things that I always make sure, or try to make sure I touch on when it comes to the future of economics and automation and the idea of any sort of universal basic income, because I think that, we want to make sure that we're all surviving. And it's kind of been absurd to me for a long time that in a prosperous society, or prosperous societies like the ones we have, that we're still tying our jobs to our survival. But at the same time, there are risks for having, say, just a government providing you something. And so what I think is adjacent to that or related to that is the idea of having and making sure that we actually democratize our work and economy in the future, so that, like you said, the power rests with the people, the wealth stays with the people instead of being further concentrated. And in any, I don't think that it's clear to me what exact schemes for this are going to be the best. And that's something that needs to be looked into in detail. And it's like what governments should actually be looking into researching is their plans for this. Because I think you need economists and people who understand the changing work landscape and automation in order to come up with the right way to do it. But I would say that in that you have to always come back to the focus of what you're trying to do, which is make sure that you don't have massive inequality and that you still have agency and democratic ability for people and power there.
So Craig has a question that relates to this. Craig, did you want to ask your question?
No mic.
Okay, I'll ask it then. So assuming companies move towards AI and robotics to drastically reduce a workforce and save costs, is it better for society to take steps to limit that move through taxation or regulation, or let it happen and fight the effects, like through a UBI?
I can start on this one. I would say a bit of both, really. I don't think that the idea for me that with regulation and taxation, it's really trying to stop it from happening. It's trying to make it happen in a way that is going to be good for everybody and kind of ensure that the outcome is positive. And you also want to make sure that something like a UBI is not addressing a already negative after effect, but is there as a preparatory measure for as we're moving forward. So for me, the biggest thing in a lot of this has been just being ready for what's coming. So you want to, the taxation, I think, or whatever it is that you choose to do along that road is necessary simply because if you're losing workforce, you're going to need the income some way, and you don't want the money to all be concentrated large scale in corporations. But you also want to make sure that local businesses, for instance, that want to get software or something that's going to really help them exist in the first place are not going to be, dealing with this sort of taxation scheme and extra bureaucracy. But we do need kind of an overall way to be ready for this so that when any of it happens, you're not watching that inequality skyrocket and you're also not leaving anybody behind, so that there is already a preset opportunity for pretty much anybody who loses their job, or on the other side of that, all the people who are currently looking for work who don't have any or who are working 3 jobs they hate, to be able to actually find something meaningful to do and are going to be able to survive and thrive a little bit even in the interim. And I think that also links to the greater concept of where we're going in terms of, what I would say is we actually should be searching for people to have something to do that they like and is meaningful, and that would be far more important than that tying of survival to work, which we're currently in.
Yeah, I agree. I think you put it very well that trying to prevent, if something is economically hugely advantageous, trying to just prevent it from happening altogether is going to be a very, very hard game to play, right? But with the right sort of preparation and incentives, you can maybe transition the way that activity happens to one that's more socially beneficial. And I think here, maybe an analogy is in energy. For a long time, fossil fuels were just cheaper, so much cheaper than lots of the alternatives. And it's been incredibly difficult to just say, let's not use fossil fuels. It's cheap. There are all kinds of, granted, extra incentives that we put on top of them to make them even cheaper. But it's very difficult to just say, uh-oh, we can't use fossil fuels, so let's now do something that is economically much, much harder to do. But once the groundwork was laid for a while of subsidizing and supporting alternative fuels so that they steadily got cheaper and cheaper, and now are dramatically cheaper in many cases than the fossil fuels, now it's kind of very easy to transition in principle to renewable energy. Now that wind and solar are cheaper than coal and oil, the transition at some level happens by itself. It is happening, but it took, so just trying to forbid fossil fuel probably would have been very, very politically and economically difficult. But we could have made that transition happen much, much earlier if we had invested more in setting up the ability to, developing economically and technologically the alternative fuels much, much earlier than we did. We could have made that transition a lot sooner and better. So I think here too, just preventing something economically, big and effective by sort of regulating it away or taxing it away is going to be very hard. But managing how it happens so that we substitute, so that we create an economic system where both the money gets made by the corporations and the people stay not just fed and sort of economically provided for, but actually fulfilled and doing things that are of value and interest to them. We can do that. There's no law of physics that says that you can't have a society, when there's huge amounts of wealth, there's no law that says you can't have that wealth benefiting all these different people. There's absolutely no reason that we shouldn't be able to do that, but we have to actually make it happen. It won't necessarily happen by itself.
Yeah, with fossil fuels, I think we definitely ended up with massive, I would even probably call it corruption, but incentives for that to continue the way it was and keep going. And I think similarly in this, we don't want to encourage it without preparation. And you don't want to, I don't think but you don't want to make sure, you don't want to regulate it out of existence. You just want to find the balance and the preparation and just always get back to being focused on the well-being of people and the positive things that could happen.
So next, Lucas has a question. Lucas, did you want to ask?
Sure. I was wondering, is the regarding AI in self-driving cars, drones and soldiers, isn't there a concern to having it being hacked by extremists to cause harm to the general public? And are there ways to help to mitigate those concerns?
Yeah, I think there's, we have unfortunately, of the many things that are super important and we've neglected as a society, unfortunately, computer security is one of the scarier ones, in that most computer systems that we use just aren't terribly secure, and that will include, self-driving vehicles and other things where the stakes are high, people will try harder to have security, but like really good computer security is a very hard problem is a very hard thing to get right, because you have to defend against every possible attack, and the attacker just has to get sort of through once, and then you're compromised. It's a very offense friendly sort of competition. So there's a danger of AI systems getting hacked, and if those AI systems are in charge of big things, then that is definitely a problem. So yeah, I think the problem is potentially self-driving cars getting hacked individually, but much scarier is the idea of the whole fleet of self-driving cars getting hacked, right? If it's all operating in one central system, if 200,000 cars suddenly are under the control of one person, that's a nightmare waiting to happen, right? So clearly, developers of self-driving cars know this. They're working very, very, very hard to make sure that doesn't happen, but it's a hard problem to do. An extra worry that is not widely appreciated with this is not so much AI systems being hacked, but AI systems doing the hacking. So we're getting to the point where if you have machine learning systems that can learn how to hack computers, which they can, then having a machine learning system, again, once you learn how to do it once, you can then do it 100 million times. So once you have a sophisticated system for hacking other computers that is flexible and can sort of attack many different sorts of devices, then you could send 100 million of those out attacking all sorts of devices. So what used to be sort of one hacker attacking one thing could be 100 million clones of some AI system attacking 100 million things. So this is a huge security threat that really keeps me up at night, I think, because the sort of security that we have on many systems is kind of, well, if we get hacked, then we'll sort of have to deal with that, and we'll issue a press release, and we'll build it into the cost of business. That's not going to work if 100 million things are getting hacked at once. So I think there's a real problem that we have in computer security that is, I'm really not sure what to do about that, because it's built into a lot of parts of the internet's infrastructure and so on. But absolutely should be talked about and thought about, because it's a huge potential for attacks on society of all sorts.
Yeah. For example, like I've already been on some of the, as I don't know, Amity, if she knew about it. I wasn't part of the beginning of the Green Party web chats that they were hacked apparently, and some people that had some, or there was some things, and they were, I believe it wasn't. That's for when I think about hacking like that, it could be even worse with all these things that are self driven or something like that. Like, so it's good to have it, these things, but I just feel like if it's going to add a whole different kind of a problem per se or concern. So yeah.
Yeah, I think what happened with the Green Party town hall wasn't really hacking. It was people who signed up and then used a bot to spew hateful messages. But it was not something so sophisticated.
Sorry, it's okay. Sorry, but my apologies.
No, it's fine. I think that somebody did use that term, and though that touches on something wider, because I do think computer security and cybersecurity is a big issue. But we're also coming up against this problem of kind of just this massive reliance on the technology that we do have, and we trust a lot of it, and that's social media platforms included, and none of it is exactly what most of us think it is, I think. And the risks that already exist there, even without improving or changing any of our technology, is huge. And it's, I think in this case, just as much a technical problem as it is a policy problem, that we actually need to, as a society, get ready for the risks that already exist that could come up, and prepare for our lives to be impacted by them. It's just like, there are so many factors, and this is such a big one that, as you say, is ignored. And it makes me think of, you know, this is completely different, but a couple weeks ago we had a solar storm, and you know, we had large outages everywhere, and it's like, okay, so cool. But nobody knows that that stuff is possible of happening, or that it might actually have impact, and that there's things going on out there that might actually change. And so similarly, I think you have security risks that nobody's monitoring, nobody's watching, nobody's dealing with, that could actually just completely overhaul everything that we already use and disrupt.
Thank you.
And you mentioned bots spewing hatred, which brings up another topic, which is bots in general, like the sort of somewhat collapse of our information ecosystem in terms of like understanding where information and news and like reality is coming from. And this is another one where I think, you know, there's no reason I feel, so California passed a law that says that in certain contexts, bots have to identify themselves as bots. I think this should be quite general and enacted in most countries. I think there's no reason why we should ever be in doubt as to whether we're communicating with a person or a machine learning or AI system. And those systems are just getting better and better. So it's now quite possible for machine learning systems to generate large blocks of very, very human sounding text to make a particular point. So there's a system called GPT-3 that's been in the news a lot lately. It can write a whole essay. It sounds like a pretty good essay. You could get a B+ or an A- in high school with the essays that this thing writes on some topic that you choose. So sending out, you know, 1 million copies of this, making some particular point, you know, in 1 million different ways on social media is going to be a massive like persuasion campaign that is now possible with with one person behind it, not 1 million. So I personally believe that we really should have regulations that label, insofar as this is possible to do, consistent with, you know, various other considerations and free speech and so on. But where we can make it, where it's possible, we should be able to know when we're being communicated with or communicating with an AI system, I believe. And I fear that we're going to very dangerous places if we don't have something like that, because we simply won't know what we're dealing with. I mean, you've probably had this experience. You pick up the phone, someone starts talking to you, and it's like, are you an actual person?
Yeah,
I am an actual person. No, you're not.
We need for sure, government needs to make a policy to have laws in place to make sure this is regulated, not just the Wild West or something like that, I guess. Or I don't know, that's a good comparison, but we need to make sure that things are in control in society and stuff like that. So in a sense.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that issue of trust that we had from earlier, where a lot of things we trust or have trusted naturally, and we already shouldn't be doing that. And then it has left all the risks open. So there's a comment here from Ross saying from mid-2014 Jeep SUVs. I remember this. So they're not self-driving. They held a vulnerability that the entertainment system could be hacked, and you could drive it. And yeah, this is a problem, and I think it's a perfect example of that. We've got issues now that maybe we should solve. Well, we've got 5 minutes of time left, so I'm probably going to give the closing. Yeah, see, there you go. Almost 500,000 vehicles were affected, and we didn't have AI yet. So there's the scope. And it was a lot of the misinformation that's going around and the massive problems we have with that. I think that it shows that we've kind of left technology to the side in terms of a lot of policy and conversation, and we need to bring it to the forefront because it is already such a huge piece of our lives. And as things evolved and evolve quickly, then we need to be prepared, and we need to get back to a place where we are not being controlled, whether on purpose or not, by technology in any way, and that it's back to being a tool for us to shape the world we actually want to have. Because I mean, you can look at all the memes and the jokes about it, how we're controlled by our life on our smartphones and social media, but there is a truth to it, and it needs to, I think, return back to something else. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Anthony, so much for being our guest today. If anybody is curious about more, I would say check out the Future of Life Institute and their work. And also kind of a little bit of what's been done in Canada with Montreal Accord. But again, we do not have any policy in Canada, much like the European Union, that actually says anything yet. So there is a great need for this. And if anybody's interested, I'm always happy to have more conversations in our platform, which, you know, is in the Green Party framework. All policy is approved by members. So what we put forward is not automatically green policy if I become leader, but it is a bunch of suggestions put forward by some experts about the way that we can actually go forward and some policy ideas. So I suggest checking that out as well. And it is not complete. But yes, so we have a leadership election that ends in a couple of weeks. Voting starts September 26th online, ends October 3rd. And we need as much help as we can get. And we're having a great time. So if you would like to join our team, please do so. We would love to have you on board. And with that, have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.